Guten Tag. Ich freue mich sehr, Sie alle im Namen der
Good
Heinrich-Böll.
afternoon. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you on behalf of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for the third session of our Decolonial Dialogues 2023. My name is Kirsten Krampen. I'm the head of the Foundation's Africa Department.
Bienvenue to the new edition of the Decolonial Dialogues. Diese Veranstaltung
This event is a digital one and a multilingual one, so there will be interpretation into German, English, and French. Please use the little globe icon down below on the menu bar of your screen.
For translation from German to English and French, please press the little globe on the bottom of your screen. Wir freuen uns sehr.
We're really happy that this year the creators team, Mahret Ifeoma Kupka, Firmin Girmay, and Thomas Fuß will be able to fill the event series with life. After the opening event on the content and direction of the decolonization debates in Europe and Africa, the second session in May dealt with different perspectives of cooperation after the restitution of looted artifacts. Today's conversation will look into possibilities for reciprocal mobility between the continents, for a new ethics of relations between Africa and Europe. This is the claim with which we would like to lead the decolonial dialogues against the backdrop of a history between the two continents that has been intertwined for centuries. Systemic approaches to decolonization can only be thought in dialogues, and this means that different perspectives and voices should have their say and can also be heard. And this is only possible if people really meet one another, if there is a vivid exchange. And so this is something that we are lacking for people from African societies because of a lack of mobility opportunities. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his or her own, says Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is not binding international law, but at least a recommendation, which is not really taken into consideration by so many states, especially those where citizens can leave and enter almost anywhere in the world without any problems. This inequality cannot be eliminated in the close future, but it's important to realize that this objective global inequality is also perceived as such by the disadvantaged. For a new ethics of our relations, it is therefore important to not only be aware of these inequalities, but to also overcome them step by step. It's about legal ways, yes, and this is what the German government is talking about lately a lot, since irregular migration is being fought so relentlessly, and the conditions in Europe's external borders are violent and inhumane towards those who take on ever more dangerous routes to leave their countries. And this is about the self and disappointed attempts to travel and stay legally, about visa issuance, about the participation in conferences and workshops, in research and sharing of expertise. Ultimately, sometimes also about finding those cultural property goods or allying with activists elsewhere. I'm delighted to be able to welcome very competent guests here today and hope to find concrete ideas from those guests and also from the participants. And with that, I would like to hand over to the curator, Mahret Ifeoma Kupka, for a short introduction. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Kirsten.
Wer über Restitution spricht,
So, whenever we talk about restitution, about decolonization, about this so-called encounters at eye level or exchange with representatives from societies of origin, is also talk about those pragmatic framework conditions in which these projects are embedded. And this is what we will try to do in today's session of the Decolonial Dialogues with very special guests that Aisha Camara will introduce in just a few seconds. So What remains to be said for me as an introduction, other than that things are bad for these framework conditions, that those encounters too often already fail at the border of Europe, that these applications are too often rejected for reasons that are difficult to understand. I can speak only about isolated incidents that are exemplary for numerous experiences that people have to make who work in transcontinental projects. Incidents that are usually not visible to visitors of exhibitions, conferences, and other gatherings. However, those incidents that many organizers of such transcontinental events have too little in mind or take them into account in their calculations too little. An invitation cannot only be limited to expressing the situation. Those who do not have a permanently valid mission permit are exposed to time-consuming, nerve-wracking visa issuance processes that are in stark contrast to officially proclaimed national cooperation efforts in matters of restitution. When restitution is supposed to mean more than the formal processing of the return of stolen cultural property, if it's to talk about personal meetings, exchange, and perhaps even something like shared healing, then it needs this physical contact, and that, of course, requires visa. One example. Last year, in September, the Transcontinental Talking Objects Lab, of which I am part, was invited to Iceland for a conference. We planned a program where we wanted to approach nature ideas in a decolonial way. We are 4 curators and 9 guests were especially invited, and 2 of the curators had German passports, the other 2 Kenyan passports. One of them a 1-year multiple entry Schengen visa that was still valid and which he had received because of several projects in Germany. And the other one needed a visa. Of the 9 guests, 2 needed a visa, and the others were either from Iceland themselves or had EU passports or a permanent residence permit. That's to say, 3 people had to apply for a visa for Iceland at the Danish embassy in Kenya, which, and this turned out later during the process, required more specific documentation than a standard Schengen visa, such as, for example, a police clearance certificate. And visas typically, for those who don't know, require some sort of disclosure of your financial and family situation. And this may seem justified. Country, of course, wants to make sure that the person entering the country has sufficient financial means to be taken care of in case of an emergency, and perhaps leaves behind a family to which he or she will most likely return. But in view of the history that connects the African continent to the European one, this disclosure is at least ethically and morally questionable. It remains to be seen what impact the recently adopted reform of the EU asylum law will have on allocation practices. I would not leave unmentioned the fact that Europeans wishing to travel to Kenya, for example, could easily obtain a visa by paying 50 euros at the passport control during entry. For a little more money, the visa was then valid almost for the whole part of Eastern Africa. And this so-called visa on arrival has been changed to an e-visa, which has to be applied in advance. And it's still unlikely that the application will be rejected. A visa practice that place our guests under suspicion of being illegal is also part of our dispute in the Talking Objects Lab. And in addition, there is an arbitrary way of treating people coming into the country. If you want to travel to Europe, it's best to submit your passport 6 months in advance to the appropriate office. So you're not able to travel during those 6 months. Then you need an outbound and return flight book with an appropriate invitation letter. That is to ensure that the visa comes in time, or the cancellation, so that flights can still be rebooked or cancelled. And this assumes that they were booked accordingly, so more expensive. And it's also more expensive to book direct flights, or at least those where the changes take place within the Schengen in order to avoid transit visas. And if we were to take all this into account, it doesn't really mean that the visa is then also available on the day of departure. So in the case of our Iceland project, one participant received her visa 1 week before departure. One participant received it so late that the flight was really expensive and had to be rebooked with a lot of changes and layovers. And then we started discussing if it was really worth coming. One curator of the event, although she works regularly in Europe and always gets her visa, did not get it at all and had to join by video call. All these uncertainties make a smooth workflow really much more difficult. And those who travel occasionally know the stress that traveling causes anyway. So a few days before departure to another continent, not knowing whether the trip can take place at all, this experience is probably not shared by many. A stress that is added on top of the regular travel and organization stress is once the visa is there, the journey begins, but the pitfalls of European border policy are far from being overcome. The internet is full of reports of dehumanizing border policies, and places like the Frankfurt airport are quite notorious. Passport controls usually take place right after landing, even before the regular checks take place at the counters, at the plane after disembarking. Those who are taken out or selected find themselves subjected to a standardized entry and search query, and if you complain, you're considered suspicious and uncooperative. Being a German citizen and thus a holder of a German passport, I'm well aware of my privilege, because it has been exactly that passport that, like a little magic book, has saved me from unpleasant situations or made them considerably easier. Do you take questions when leaving South Africa, on the way back to Germany, at the gate, by the airline ground stuff? So what's your final destination? Frankfurt. Where were you born? In Hanau. Where is that exactly? Well, really close to Frankfurt. And then I'm observing, watching the gate, and a white person is questioned. My friend, who's black and has a German passport, has the exact same thing happen at her same place. Coincidence? Such recurring experiences make it increasingly difficult to behave cooperatively. On my flight to Iceland, I observed on one of the 3 open counters at check-in at Frankfurt Airport that there's a man standing for a very long time, occupying the counter for 30 minutes while I am standing in queue and waiting. The airport employee is typing away. She's stressed out, telephoning once and again. And when I reach the counter next to her, then I see no EU passport. I don't really know what the problem was, but when one of our curators told me a few days later how she stood at the Iceland air counter for what felt like an eternity and had her passport checked from front to back, top and bottom, I had to think back to this man. And all this in the midst of a crowd of people, all white, all in practical outer clothing, perhaps excitedly anticipating their lifelong dream, a vacation in Iceland, and all of them highly desirable tourists who will definitely leave again, and the others suspicious, extensively eyed. The experience in Iceland caused some frustration. How can we meet one another under these conditions? But the experience also generated hope. We, the curators, concluded our debriefing with a question to ourselves: what do I need in order to make those encounters possible in the future? That we all have to work together is also a result of incredibly important work of trust. This story, as I said, is only one example that shows that even letters of invitation from official German institutions, such as the Goethe Institute, are no guarantee of obtaining a visa. And even the GFFO as an organizer doesn't really make a difference. There are so many absurd occurrences. A survey that was carried out recently, addressed to host organizations and artists on mobility from African countries to Schengen countries, organized by On the Move, wanted to collect information on the kind of problems encountered since June 2019 until the time of the survey. It also aimed to elicit the related implications for the hosting organizations and the invited artists and or cultural professionals. A very important survey that showed that visa issuances are getting more in the focus, especially when it comes to clarifying framework conditions for collaborations that should really take place at the eye level. It takes a lot to create the right spaces that make such an encounter even possible. Spaces where visions for possible common futures can emerge, like the decolonial dialogues that want to contribute to this. And with that, I would like to hand over to Aisha Camara, who is our moderator. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome. I am very happy that once again we are going to have a decolonial dialogue and an interesting debate, and I'm happy to be the facilitator. Today it's especially interesting because, as I was said before, the debate we're going to have today is very relevant. Of course, all the topics that we discuss in the framework of the decolonial dialogues are relevant. It's all about decolonialization, and this is a relevant topic and is widely discussed in Germany and in Europe, and we have many transcontinental projects. And today we have another relevant issue, namely mobility. And here we do not mean the mobility of objects or knowledge or products. We are going to talk about the mobility of people, specific people from specific regions wanting to go to Europe. And as it was already mentioned, it is widely discussed also in the framework of the European Union asylum law. So it's a very relevant debate, and we have very interesting people to talk about these issues. And I would like to ask everybody now to turn on their camera so we can all see you. And we also would like to say hello to our YouTube followers. Everyone follow us on Zoom. You can all use the Q&A section to ask your questions, and we are going to respond later to your questions. First of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I start with Wale Lawal. Welcome to you. It's wonderful to have you here. Wale Lawal is the founder of The Republic, a digital media startup company that covers African stories about African countries. He's the editor-in-chief of The Republic, which has won an award, and they publish news and debates on politics and culture and science from the point of view of Nigeria. He's also the co-founder of GatePass, a digital payment and community management platform. Recently, he's also worked as a research and consultancy expert, providing consultancy to African governments and companies. He is a graduate of Oxford University and has focused on tech startups in Nigeria during his research. He also published short stories and has also exhibited at Venice Biennale and other exhibitions. There are many more things I could mention about his biography, but I think you have already understood that he is an expert that can talk about our issues from many different perspectives. Welcome to you, Wale Lawal. My first question goes to you right away. Today, everybody seems to be focused on decolonialization. Everything is being decolonialized. What do you think about these discourses?
Yes, no, thank you so much, Aisha, and thank you so much to the organizers for this event. I think you're absolutely right to start off with this question, because I think we've spoken about this, and I think I've been on so many panels. I think I spent over a decade now studying decolonization theory, and I think what we do get a sense of these days is this question of, so when does the decolonization happen? There's that quote that's always ringing to my mind that the American writer James Baldwin, has, which is, how much time do you want for your progress? you know, there's that big question of, we've been talking about decolonization, we've been talking about this process, and I think it's also now become a bit convenient in many circles to kind of just keep this as a kind of ongoing process. But there needs to be some sort of outcome, and I think there needs to be some sort of imagination of what that looks like. And so, you know, I think there's a running joke that I have, which is that, you know, I had someone tell me recently that we need to decolonize decolonization. It's gotten that, you know, it's gotten to that level. But I think these days, what you find from, you know, intellectuals, creatives on the ground, people who are really thinking about these issues from the African continent, is this question of readiness, right? So are we really ready for the decolonization that we speak of? And I think in the context of mobility, that really, you know, compels us to ask that question of, this globalization that we've been speaking of, is it really a universal globalization? Or is it a globalization of Western ideas, of European ideas, of Europeans in general, or the West itself? And I think readiness really confronts us, or makes us ask that question of, you know, what did we really expect from a globalized world? Did we expect a world in which there would be no Africans traveling for work or to live, you know, in pursuit of better economic, you know, goals in these countries? And I think readiness really compels us to ask that question. And I think we should be asking ourselves, you know, really sincerely, are we ready for the decolonization that that we're constantly championing? And I'm really hoping that we can get a sense of that discussion today, because I think it's really gotten to that point where we need to ask ourselves that we've spent decades talking about decolonization, and now it's become very acceptable, it's become a mainstream term, but are we really ready for what decolonization implies?
Vielen, vielen Dank erstmal soweit. Ich denke, wir werden später natürlich noch auf die Frage der Readiness, der Bereitschaft und wie diese konkret aus.
Thank you very much. We're going to talk about readiness and how readiness could really look like. And I think Professor Gouaffo, our next panelist, is also going to say something about that. And probably you can respond to Wale. Welcome to you, Professor Dr. Albert Gouaffo. He comes from the Université de Dschang from West Cameroon. He teaches and is a researcher of German literature and cultural studies, and also an expert in intercultural communication between Africa, Germany, and France. His research focus is German studies, comparative literature, theory of narration, and he has a lot of experience that he can talk about, especially when it comes to a research project that he has conducted together with the Ethnological Museum in Munich. Probably he's going to talk about that, but before he actually does that, Professor Gouaffo, may I ask you a question first? How important is mobility as a factor for decolonialization? We've already said we have been talking about decolonialization for decades. Thank you, Aisha, for this presentation and for the introduction. I would like to thank the organizers for making it possible to get together with all of you today. Thanks for having taken the initiative to organize encounters so that we can talk about transcontinental mobility and the mobility between the African and the European continents. Well, when we talk about visa issues, that is very relevant in terms of mobility. Africans and Europeans. Long time ago, the Africans were colonialized and the Europeans were the colonizers. Now today we are the migrants. When we think of colonialization, we always see that as a phenomenon that is no longer there. At least when we take the case of Germany and Cameroon. Take the case of 1919. Germany is seen as a country that has become post-colonial ever since 1919, because that was the year when the colonies were given up by Germany. So the idea is that the colonial project was a European project, and Germany only played a minor role and contributed on a minor scale. Now, today, when we talk about mobility and visa, I would say that it's a problem that is not only related to the conditions that Europeans and Germans have when traveling. The question just is, how are these measures used? Obviously, there are different ways and means in which visa are granted. Let me give one example. I work in the field of provenance research. I like President Steinmeier's speech when he talked at the opening of the Humboldt Forum. He said, it's about time we start a dialogue on an equal footing, on an eye-to-eye level, when it comes to the African countries that were robbed of their cultural assets and the European countries that have acquired or looted these artifacts. And he talked about a different future. But what do we see when we look at the day-to-day realities? I was also involved in a cooperation project. There was a special focus in that project. It was a cooperation project called Five Continents. Our university, the University of Dschang, was involved. I put together a team of researchers. I had a postdoc, 2 doctors, and a professor on my team. Now, what happened then? According to our project plan, we wanted to look at the objects that were in different storage rooms of museums and cultural institutions. In the beginning, the only thing we had were pictures that I used to do some research on the ground. But then the moment was come to go to the embassy to apply for a visa. And then we were told the visa applications came in too late. Basically, the embassy said, yeah, we were ready to grant you a visa. We have received the invitation, but we didn't get the documents. There was a specific problem about one of my postdoc students. I had signed her application. I had provided a certificate that she works at Dschang University as a postdoc. And the embassy, they have doubts about the genuine nature of that documents, but also some other public authorities of Cameroon had signed that document. I mean, if we talk about cooperation, you have to respect at least the public authorities of the country that you want to work with. Now, there is some kind of exchange between us as universities, museums. We were able to agree on a meeting. But that postdoc student, although she had a contract to be on the team of our project, had difficulties. And her visa finally was not granted. They told her it's not convincing, and the embassy doesn't believe in the authenticity of her documents, and there is a danger that after traveling to Munich, she could maybe stay in Germany. And we told the embassy, I mean, this is not the first time this person travels. She has been to Germany. She's returned to her home country. So there is dehumanization. And even in post-colonial times, we see such discrimination. Demands were made for the person to come after returning from Germany, coming again to the embassy to show that indeed she traveled back. And the second day, the first time she did that, she went to the embassy, and the second time she was totally rejected. Then I had another colleague, 64 years old, the dean of our university. He was also not granted a visa, and they told him the reason for that is that he has just supplied a copy of his birth certificate instead of the original. We said, no problem, we can give you the original. And the embassy just said, no, not possible anymore. So this is how they treat us. The meeting we wanted to have ended up in just being a Zoom conference. So this shows you what the situation looks like. And I said, this is not the way to go forward. This is just arbitrary treatment. And maybe it's not only discrimination, it's structural racism. I talked to colleagues and we contacted the media. And as a result, we were finally given an opportunity to travel. We then could meet in person for another meeting. But still, our young postdoc student had to go to the German embassy once she returned to Cameroon. This is dehumanizing treatment, because this is done in the name of the law. And now imagine an African citizen goes to Europe, wants to see the treasures of her ancestors, the treasures that were looted, and it's impossible for that person to go there to get a contact with the objects that used to belong to their ancestor. And the only reason why she's denied that opportunity is the option that she might not go back to her country. I mean, of course, the border authorities have all opportunities to check whether a person has left the country or not. So what we want to have, a dialogue. That is something that is not always implemented in deed. Now I'd like to introduce the third panelist. This is Tiaji CEO. She works, among others, at the Foreign Office of Germany, and she joined us today as a representative of the group Diplomats of Color, and she's going to tell us what that organization is all about. In 2015, she started studying and working at the same time at the Foreign Office. She was in China, Senegal, Vietnam, Mozambique. She is the founder of Diplomats of Color Network, and she's also the founder of Diversity. That's another organization bringing together people from public authorities, and she's going to introduce that herself. She's just returned from the United States, has studied at Harvard University, and got her master's degree. Today, she's with us. Welcome to have, and nice to have you here.
So many thanks for the invitation. Oh, I'm pleased. I would like to start out a bit beforehand. We have heard quite concrete experiences. I would like to ask you a question about maybe just to start out about your position, your position you fill as a young people of color who's a diplomat and is pursuing a diplomatic career. And as we've said before, the buzzword racism has been mentioned before. There's a huge debate in Germany about structural racism, racism in the structures, in the administration, the authorities, and maybe could you just briefly touch upon that issue? What did motivate you to be part of the German administration, being a people of color? And we've heard how this can impact people's lives from the diaspora, people coming from African states. So what motivated you to become part of the administration? What motivated you to found Diplomats of Color? Yes, thank you for the question. First of all, I would like to say that I'm not here on behalf of the Foreign Office, but as an initiator of the initiative Diplomats of Color, and I'm therefore sharing my own opinion. To your questions. For me personally, I've always been interested in foreign and security policy, and this has been the main driver for me to choose a profession that has a certain relation to exterior and security policy, but which is quite international. So we are trying to move the international cultural and political relations between different states. And this was really interesting to me when I chose that profession or that position. And then I think which was decisive for me is to see that people who are marginalized in Germany, that are still underrepresented in the administration, in the political sphere. More generally speaking, in those decision-making positions, so the higher you get in the career hierarchy, this really motivated me to found a network, a group that is called Diplomats of Color. And with the help of that network, we try to interconnect colleagues, employees within the German Federal Foreign Office who are committed to realize more diversity, more balanced opportunities, and we are working as volunteers. And I think the added value that we add to this is that we have a new perspective that we would like to introduce to the German federal foreign policy. And I think this is really important when we talk about issues like decolonization, because all too often we have those aspects that are overlooked, and people that because of their own family history may have a totally different perspective can really be a beneficial factor. So maybe we have forgotten about that certain aspects. So when it's about structures, about structural discrimination, and when we then elevate it to the next level, if we have the global vision to see the north-south difference today, we've talked about already about different visa decisions and how this can impact people very differently, depending on where you are from. So one could ask that question, so what is this all due to? So what are those root causes in our self-understanding, how we look towards African countries, and where we can question ourselves, so what kind of an impact does it have on our lives and on our diplomatic relations with those countries? And this is why I'm really delighted to be able to take part in this very interesting panel and to hear about the perspectives of the other panelists. Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to ask you a follow-up question. It is quite obvious. We've heard about it already. So from the curator and as well from Professor Gouaffo, there is the question about, do we really want to do it? Is there a readiness for this exchange at eye level? And the fact that people from the African country shall be mobile enough in order to be able to travel and take part in those encounters. And we were talking about a certain arbitrariness when deciding upon certain visa issuances. So we're talking about the root causes. And then we might have the rejection or the case of arbitrariness. So how do diplomats of color position themselves when it's all about dealing with those cases, those incidents? Well, I think it's always worthwhile to zoom out just a little.
Ich glaube sozusagen, dass wie wir Länder unterschiedlich,
because the way how we treat different countries differently when it comes to mobility, when it comes to possibilities of entry in different countries, then this is very closely intertwined with the perception
wie wir auf diese Länder blicken.
The perception of those countries in our eyes, and the way how we prioritize different countries. Professor Gouaffo already underlined it. Much has been said about the cooperation at eye level. And from my own experience, from my own perspective, I've become well aware that the rhetorical instrument is used once and again, but in reality, when we talk about our partners in foreign countries, this is not perceived the same way that we really have a dialogue at eye level. I think we have to consider nowadays that Africa and Europe are as closely intertwined as North and South America. But in the relationship between those two countries, we have a closer dialogue. And this, in terms of the different issues like mobility, migration, economic relations, cultural relations, we have to rethink our position because there is really a close relationship between those two continents. And maybe just lastly, before I finish, where are those continuities? Why do we have this different treatment or this imbalance? So when we look towards colonial continuities or post-colonialism, this is something where we see that we still have the idea that migration has to be avoided. When it's about security aspects, then migration is usually an obstacle to security. And so on the ecological sphere, it's about extraction of resources, of commodities, and it's always in the best interest of German companies to extract, and all these aspects lead to the fact that nowadays we do have this different perception, this different treatment, and a decolonial vision is really worthwhile to see how those power relations are distributed. Many thanks to you. And I would like to get back to Wale. We have heard quite some bits about bad experiences. We have heard about, or maybe the claim, the call from diplomats of color to rethink different structures. So how do you think all this issue, visa and practices, is how this is perceived in Nigeria? How do people assess the situation? So we are in a social transformation process where many people from the African continent may talk more openly about those practices than used to be the case just a decade ago.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think, again, it just speaks to the kind of time that we're in this kind of like hyper-connected, hyper-exposed, hyper-globalized era. But of course, we know that this globalization isn't really always happening on equal terms. And that's why I keep, returning to that concept of readiness. Are we really ready to, to be able to address these issues on those equal terms? I think in terms of perceptions, of course, the perceptions are varied. I think, for a lot of people, for a lot of people, there is some pragmatism in believing that, look, countries have a right to determine how people, migrate to their countries or to determine their visa structures, and that's fine. But I think what the root cause here, what the real issue here, isn't necessarily even in the visas themselves, which we can get into because it's an entire system that has just kind of like needs an entire overhaul. But it's in the kind of thinking that it that it reflects, and the kind of, you get a visa, but even the visa process itself is indignifying. And there's a lot of, justification around, oh, we're trying to clamp down on illegal migration or all of those things. But even those people who are migrating legally are still facing gross amounts of discrimination. And so what's the point? That's the question that a lot of people really have. And I think also, I think there's something to be said about the power dynamics that are often kind of like overlooked or left out of the debate. In that when you apply for a visa, you are playing a power game. And it's not the same thing if an American citizen is applying for a Nigerian visa, or if a German citizen is applying for a Nigerian visa, as a Nigerian applying for a German or Schengen visa. And I'll give you an example. Quite recently, and I shared this, it's something that kind of took off online, where we've had the situation happening in Sudan with the conflicts that are happening. And then you had passports in the Dutch embassy, and someone kind of sent them a tweet saying, oh, will we be able to get our passports? We're trying to evacuate. We're stranded because we don't have any passports. And then the Dutch embassy replies also on Twitter saying, dear whoever it was, we're sorry about your situation, but we had to evacuate all our staff. And in the process, we had to destroy all the passports. We encourage you to apply for a new passport from your local authorities. Which local authorities? That's the first question. And then the second thing is, okay, if it is the rules, and because I did do some further research into this, and embassies often find themselves in this situation where they have to evacuate, they have to destroy materials to avoid issues with identification, and for security reasons, fair enough. But we also live in a world that will discriminate against those same Sudanese people if they should try to seek asylum in Germany or in any European country, despite the fact that their passports had been destroyed in quotes for legitimate reasons. And so there's a lot of contradiction, and there's a lot of things that aren't really adding up. There's this whole sense that you're paying for a visa, even when you're applying for a visa and you successfully get it, you're still kind of treated the way you're treated, even when you arrive at the airport and when you're at the border. There's this entire sense that they are doing you a favor, or that you are kind of like that you're not really contributing towards that economy, which is very untrue. One of the debates that I'm also very heavily engaged in right now is is more relevant to the UK, where they've been making some revisions at the moment to their student visas. It's this idea that, with students, they're bringing in so many dependents and things like that. But often left out of the picture is the fact that students, from West Africa, if you just even look at a subset of the students from West Africa, which are the elites, right, contribute over £40 million to the UK every year. An overwhelming number of these people are Nigerian, but this is only the elites, right? These are people who are going to like private schools, secondary schools, high schools. So when you look at people who are going to universities, the gross majority of people who are going to universities, it is a huge amount. You're paying really high application fees. You're also paying a health surcharge, which is something that you pay when you're applying for the UK. You're not really entitled to NHS treatments, which is the public healthcare system, or you don't really use it, but you're paying to fund these things. But often in the narrative around immigration and the narrative around people coming into those countries, that's left out of the picture. And it's often presented like these people are just coming in and using their resources. But that is a flat out lie, to be honest. And I think it also just warrants further, interrogation. One of the big things I've been asking is, if the UK and many other African countries are claiming to be in a sort of financial crisis, what have they been doing with the money that these people have been bringing in, even the people that are coming in on a legal basis? There's a huge question, and a lot of us are asking that question, because you can't frame it like you're doing us a favor when it's an entirely economic decision, when people are paying to attend these, to go into these countries. In the UK, for example, you pay a separate fee for being an international student. And that fee is almost, I think, 3 times what UK citizens pay. So what's happening to all that funding? What's happening to all that money? And I think there's a big question there around just the entire visa system and the entire ways in which, money flows into that system. But the people who are actually paying and funding those systems are the ones being mistreated the most. And I think that question is something we're not really asking enough of. And I think it's something that a lot of us should be putting a lot more pressure on. We're complaining around there being a lot of issues around people coming into those countries, but these people are paying. They're paying exorbitant amounts of money, and nobody's asking where that money is going to, or what's happening with that money, or what that money is funding. I remember I was in a conversation with someone recently, and they were like, "Oh, but schools are limited, resources are limited, etc., etc." But again, people are paying. So what's happening to that money? Is that money being used to kind of create more schools, to devote more resources to hospitals. There's a lot of complaints at the moment about scarcity of doctors, medical professionals, but people are paying. So I don't think it's something that I think a lot of us should be wiser than falling prey to propaganda and the way in which these things can be framed in the media. And we should be asking serious questions in the sense that the gross majority of people who are migrating from the continent are migrating legally, which means that they're paying amounts, and what is happening with that money. I think that's a question that we all need to be asking as well.
Vielen Dank und nicht nur das.
Thank you very much. It's not just the students from Africa that create added value to the society when they migrate legally. As Professor Gouaffo said, there are active attempts by German and European institutions to invite those people to come. We just talked about the Foreign Office of Germany that issues the visa and lets people in or doesn't let them in. But there are so many other institutions and partners that have institutional power in Europe, in Germany in particular. Professor Gouaffo, what is your experience? One visa authority says no. What does the Ethnological Museum or university do? What is the role of the other European institutions? They also depend on mobility happening. Can I start talking now?
Ja, bitte, sehr gerne.
With pleasure.
Oui, avant de revenir à votre question, je voulais ajouter.
Before responding to your question, allow me to mention another example. An example to illustrate where the money goes that Africans contribute. I am a university professor. I've studied German studies. I cannot issue a certificate for a student in Cameroon that knows German. The German embassy would not recognize my certificate of German knowledge. They only recognize the certificates issued by the Goethe Institute. And this is where they are being taught by citizens of Cameroon, teachers from Cameroon, and they cannot even issue a certificate. It has always to be the Goethe Institute that issues the certificate. Last year, I conducted a statistical survey. 5,000 citizens from Cameroon underwent the test for language proficiency level A, B, so about 5,000 students. Now, on average, that means quite a significant amount of money paid by the students to study German, but only a third of those who have successfully passed the proficiency test get allowed to travel to Germany. So language is used as an instrument of power. And this money that is paid by the student goes to Germany, several billions. I try to take a closer look at those stories. And I wanted to highlight the cooperation situation between Germany and Cameroon. There is a treaty, a cooperation treaty that was signed in 1961. And as far as cultural cooperation is concerned, the first cooperation contract or treaty was signed in 1981. And that treaty says nothing whatsoever about the colonial relations that Germany had with Cameroon. They pretend as if is no different from, say, Korea or China or any other place. In that cooperation agreement, nothing is being said about being given the opportunity to open a center to teach the national language also in Germany. So any money that the poor citizens of Cameroon pay, although they never get a visa, will all be taken back to Germany, and it's all tax-free. And that money is used to finance so-called German-Cameroon cooperation without the state of Cameroon ever getting a single penny from that amount of money. So that is the situation in terms of languages. Our colleagues talked about visa fees that are not being reimbursed in case your visa is denied. Visa policy is not naive. All these issues need to be revised, need to be put on the table. And when we talk about relations between states, it's not so much about friendship, it's all about interests. And if we want to achieve another level, a better level of cooperation, we have to be on our guard. We have to monitor the way in which visa applicants are being treated. If you fulfill all the criteria that the country you want to go to demands, you should be granted a visa without any problem. I have been traveling to Germany many times ever since 1989. It's nearly 40 years I've been traveling back and forth. And every time I go to the embassy, they ask me, what do you want to do in Germany? Do you have any relatives there? It's always the same old question. Every time. And there was a moment when I got angry. I said, you know, I am a teacher. I'm invited to attend a colloquium. Everything is being financed. What else do you want? Sometimes I feel like withdrawing my application, just turning my back on them and just simply going home. But I try to keep my temper and try to understand. Then I go to the airport and there's the officer, the border police, who asked me again what I want to do in Germany. I said, I'm going to attend a conference. I'm invited as a speaker. I'm a university professor. And they ask me about which discipline. I tell them. Then that person tries to test my knowledge of German. A policeman tries to test my German language, although I have got all the papers. That person has scanned the visa, everything is fine. So is it still the logic for visa checks, or are there any other goals? You really have to ask yourselves, what do we want? Don't we want to have a different kind of dialogue? So far, it's just been a monologue in a way. And there's so much being written and said between the lines. We should really finally stop doing that. Let me just talk about the institution that invites you, like the university. How could the university support you so that those things you talked about would no longer happen? Have you ever encountered a situation where the inviting institution supported? We have heard that documents of universities of Cameroon do not get accepted. But what is the role of the universities of Germany or the museums as inviting institutions? Can they exert a certain amount of pressure?
Dans le cas du Munich,
as far as Munich is concerned,
l'initiative est même
I
venue
worked with the museum there,
de prendre attache avec
and they had taken the initiative to work with us. They got in contact with the Foreign Office
avant de nous être envoyés. Donc,
because the first time they sent the invitation to the consulate departments in Cameroon before the invitation got sent to us. So the consular department had the original for some time. All right, then we said, my researchers first need to check if all their documents are complete before actually turning up at the embassy. And as far as birth certificates are concerned, of course, okay, you know, you need your passport, you need your birth certificate. I mean, of course, you will have your birth certificates, otherwise you cannot get a passport in your own country. So the embassy just saying, well, we need your original birth certificate, although they have the passport. That is humiliating.
Vielen Dank. Tiaji, vielleicht noch mal
Tiaji,
zur Klärung.
can I come back to you? I mean, for persons that have the privilege of not worrying too much about all these issues, it sounds absurd. I mean, I would like to find out, how do institutions work together? How do they set up a project regarding decolonialization and international encounters and exchange? How do these institutions work with other authorities like the Foreign Office? They have a say in who is going to come or not to come to Germany. How do these institutions work with the Foreign Office? It's a question I cannot even answer. I'm not a visa expert. But let me highlight another aspect. I think all the examples we heard today are very telling. And of course, they expose a deep level of what's going on. I think in 2020, there was a major debate about structural racism here in Germany. And so it's not so new. Colored people, Black people, no matter where they come from the African continent or the European diaspora, they're exposed to racism in Germany, also vis-a-vis institutions. And that brings me back to the work of Diplomats of Color, our organization. We are persons representing various communities of the diaspora, and we try to open the eyes of public institutions, and hopefully that will make people aware, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of power that you can use when you have the right to allow or deny a visa. Of course, they have to abide by the law, but they must also have a certain room of discretion. And when there is some unconscious bias, and if you're biased in the first place because of your negative experience with other applicants, or because of your socialization, that has something to do with the way that those individuals, those officials decide visa applications. And so we try to make people aware so that every time they get an application, they would be open-minded and try to avoid such unpleasant situations. And that is very important for us as an organization.
Alors, qui prend la parole?
Who's going to talk next?
Allô?
Allow me to
Als Moderatorin, wir haben hier gerade kleine technische Probleme. Daher
take over the role of facilitator. Aisha seems to be having some technical problems. Ah, Aisha's back with us again. Does it work, Aisha? Can you take over again?
okay, wunderbar.
Great.
Jetzt fallen jetzt hier die Deutschen aus dem Internet raus. Das ist ja
So it's the Germans that drop out of the internet or Zoom. Interesting.
vielen, vielen Dank, Tiaji.
Thank you very much, Tiaji. CEO. I unfortunately couldn't hear everything you said, but you have said there is obviously underneath the surface a certain bias, structural racism, many of the things that we are widely discussing in Germany. Once again, the sound was poor, but it has improved again. Now, let's turn to another topic. We talked about what Europe could do, and maybe we should also talk about what the opportunities are to do something from an African perspective. Of course, there are the national states and the diplomatic relations they have. Here, Professor Gouaffo, in our preparation session, had an idea. Cameroon is interested in its citizens being allowed to travel everywhere and be welcomed. Of course, as long as they have the necessary documents. So what could the state of Cameroon do now as a counter-reaction? We know that citizens, European citizens, travel to Cameroon very often.
Well, I do think that visa issues are a question of diplomacy. So we don't have this question. Diplomacy is the principle of reciprocity. And I think that the African states have to be sufficiently courageous to claim reciprocity when it comes to visa issuances. When there is to be determined that despite of having the necessary documentation present, people are not treated equally. One might have the impression that Europe would need migration. It does not need migration. So it is a world full of interdependencies. We have a shared history. We are dependent from one another, and this is caused by the course of history. And it's absurd to think that one could live independently of other countries. This is reality. Those are the facts that are on the table. So now when we look towards Ukraine, it is a regional conflict that has been turned into a global conflict that has shown quite clearly how dependent we are on one another. So we have to exit this narrative of those multi-layered impossibilities. So we have to claim our space, and we have to think about different alternatives. Because I do think that if we are to express our unsatisfaction about this mistreatment, I think the best way of saying so is applying the principle of reciprocity. And this is what I want to say about it. So thank you so much. I would now like to hand over to Nigeria. The principle of reciprocity and we have talked about readiness before. So would this be a first step in the right direction or towards readiness when Nigeria would make those conditions more complicated in order to be able to enter the country? Or what else could we do or could we say about readiness? What would count in when we consider readiness?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good question. I think
Gute Frage.
the first thing that I would want to kind of emphasize is a need to kind of pay a closer attention to the visa system, right? So I think that that's what needs overhauling. I think unless there's actually like deliberate measures being taken to really take a closer look at the visa system, we're not going to be fixing the problem. Now, what do I mean? What do I mean by that closer look? There's a lot that's happening, or there's a lot that visa systems have become, right? So visa systems have not just, they're not just, or visas are not just these documents that go on your passports. They are cultural phenomenon. They are, you know, status symbols. They are economic signals. They are, in many ways, also political statements, right? They speak to your ability to be accepted or rejected, or to be kind of, you know, or to be allowed into, or to be allowed to participate in this kind of global world that we're in which, of course, Europe occupies a very, very, you know, important place. And of course, Africa also occupies a very important place in this global world, or in this rapidly globalizing world. And we can't expect that a world in which, you know, travel is increasingly accessible, a world in which, you know, things are really globally decentralized, we then start to put limits on the movements of African people. So I don't think the issue. So so for me, when I think about the issue, I think it really warrants a closer look at the visa systems and really thinking about ways in which we can start to hold those visa organizations very, you know, a lot more accountable. And what does that look like? Number one, it's really you know, personally, I'm looking at number one, you know, regularizing audits. I think it's very important that we start to ask ourselves, okay, people are applying for visas. How many of these visas are getting, you know, processed every year? How quickly are they getting processed? You know, what is the actual process for processing these visas? How many of these are getting rejected? Because the other thing that we often don't talk very often about is the fact that if your visa is rejected, you've still paid the amount. You're not getting a refund, right? And again, there's that arbitrariness. You get your visa gets rejected. You don't really have the opportunity to find out why it was rejected. Nobody's giving you feedback. No, but there's no sense in which, oh, you know, we actually want you to come, but you haven't really met the standards. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lack of transparency within that entire system. And I think number one thing that I would kind of really advocate for is really making it more transparent. Number two, regularizing audits, whether it's annual audits, whether it's biannual audits, and then publishing the results of those audits. It's important that we start to put figures and we start to put reality behind the actual visa processes, and also just making it very possible, or making those websites or those information guides or whatever around visa processes more legible. There's just so much that is opaque about visa application systems. For example, another one I'll bring up is, of course, these days, increasingly, people don't apply to a specific embassy directly. They go through companies that embassies outsource the visa processing to, right? So whether it's VFS Global, whether it's other, you know, other initiatives, there must be some way for us to understand these processes better and for us to hold them accountable. And I think that really starts off with auditing. I think the first step is really breaking down how many visas are we processing? What is the average visa processing time? How much has been spent in this visa processing, and what exactly is happening with the money? Is it being used to improve the visa processes? Is it being used to make them more, you know, more convenient for the people applying for these visas? Where is the money going to, right? And then also, what is the ratio of people who are getting accepted and rejected? And what's the ratio of those people who are getting rejected who have now been, you know, who have tried again and then been accepted? Because that also happens, right? You have people who are serially rejected and are now part of this system that is just completely taking their money with no explanation as to why or how they're being rejected. And I think we need to start asking that. And of course, there needs to be feedback mechanism. We live in a world where people can give their feedback and where people should feel emboldened and empowered to give their feedback if they feel that they've been mistreated. And we need to be able to document that feedback and to be able to track whether that feedback is improving or declining as the years progress. So you will notice that a lot of the metrics and a lot of the variables that I'm mentioning simply do not exist at the moment. It's very difficult to hold these visa institutions accountable because they've made it impossible to do so. And they've made it such that there's no metric by which you can hold them, and all we have to refer to are personal anecdotes. But I think it really starts from holding them accountable and by demanding more transparency. And we can do that through those processes that I've mentioned.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Ich glaube, das war wirklich jetzt
many thanks for this input. I think this has been quite precise, the idea of the principle of reciprocity, of on the diplomatic level, but on the same time to create more transparency, to assess the situation, to know everything about facts and figures in order to create some kind of accountability for those visa issuing authorities. The next question addresses Tiaji. We are talking about concrete solutions. How can we do it better in the future? What would be your claims from diplomats of color? Of course, you're not really looking into visa processes, but something maybe more comprehensive. Thank you for that question. I would like to respond to one of the things that Lawal just announced. So what happened to rejected visa applications? What are your legal possibilities? So you have a possibility to call for redress. There are different legal possibilities that, of course, require the necessary knowledge and the necessary funding. And from my perspective, when you want to have a more accessible system, then you need three main aspects. First of all, simple facilitation and digitalization, because first and foremost, on the African continent, you're not even able to find a visa issuing authority in all the different cities. We don't even have that infrastructure everywhere. So sometimes it has to do with very long distance travels in order to be able to even apply for visa. And so this is all about, and we have many different possibilities that have been tried out in other countries, maybe external service providers where you can apply for a visa with the help of those mediators. And this is why we enter into digitalization. So how can we debureaucratize the system and the processes? And we were talking about the submission of documents to facilitate the presentation of documents. And then when it's about imaging different places in the world, let's look towards the Latin American continent. So if we were to compare the situation, German embassies in the African countries may not be less in number as compared to Latin America. And this is where we see where our priorities lie. And I think this is a little switch, a little possibility to adjust the system. Then, of course, we would have to look at the consequences globally, what the relationship between different countries and states is. And to be more precise, currently there are 40 states or people from countries that are privileged enough in order to be able to enter Germany without any visa and have the possibility to apply for a residence permit. And then we have 60 states currently that do not need a Schengen visa, but they need a D visa. So let's say they come to Germany to study. One example are the Seychelles. So to make this more clear, a student from the Seychelles that would like to come to Germany to study, he has to turn to the embassy in Nairobi in order to apply for a visa, although he has the possibility to enter the German country 3 months free of visa. So one has to ask oneself, what do you need so many resources in order to apply for that visa? Why do all those people coming from countries that can enter Germany free of visa can enter the country, then apply for a longer standing visa? This is just one example of how we could change the system bit by bit in order to save staff, in order to save money, and to deviate the system in order to create new infrastructure. There's a high migration pressure on the African continent. In order to live up to this pressure, we need to create fair processes for each and everyone and to be more transparent and more accessibility. I think those are the core aspects that we are dealing with. Many thanks as well for this very tangible example that makes it a lot clearer of how intransparent the process really is. Mr. Gouaffo, you wanted to say something? You have your mic turned on? I was just responding to a message that I received, sorry. So I think we would take a quick look at our Q&As. Please go on asking your questions. We have some more time answering those questions, but we received a question that fits well with the discussion. So the question is, are there differences across societal groups when trying to obtain a visa? So like maybe different social layers. Are there any differences when it comes to applying for a visa? I don't know who wants to respond to that question. Wale, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. There are differences. I think it's definitely very much class-based differences in the first place make it such a big thing. I think it also varies by income level, by the kind of profession that you're in. You know, certain professions have it easier than others, especially if, you know, you're working in a more formal sector. And of course, you know, speaking from a Nigerian perspective, we live in a country where more people are likely to work in, are likely to be entrepreneurs running their own businesses. They may be also earning just as much as people who work in offices. But the issue is that I think that lack of context and the lack of understanding often makes it very difficult for them to be able to then travel, because, it's going to be like, oh, you're working at a company that we don't recognize or we don't know, or, all those types of things. I think so that number one makes it an issue. Number two is, of course, absolutely, it's very difficult if you're not from a certain, I think it's also very class-based. It's very difficult when I think I think for people of a certain class, especially for people from the more elite classes, these are people who are likely applying for visas or have always been applying for visas since they were born, let's put it that way. And so they're in the system. And so, when they apply, they can always look back and see historical applications, etc. Even though, to be honest, that arbitrariness still means that it might not mean much, but it does still give them a better experience of the visa process than the majority of people. And I think in many ways also it varies by gender. I think especially when you're applying for a visa to Europe, I think there's also it varies by gender in two different ways. I think it plays into certain stereotypes. So for example, there's a huge, I guess, there's a lot of stereotyping and a lot of prejudice around, occupations like sex work and things like that. And so sometimes when women apply for visas, if they're applying unaccompanied by men, there's a way in which their visa applications are read. And there are certain questions that they might be asked during the visa interviews that, that will come across as intrusive and also prejudiced in that way. And also there are certain countries that you might want to apply to as a guy increasingly where, stereotypes around things like fraud or things like, terrorism may then be brought up into your application. So there are all these nuances that you need to navigate, despite the fact that you filled out an application form, you filled it out in the best way that you can. There are all these nuances that still apply. So I'd say yes, there are definitely different experiences depending on your class, depending on your gender, depending on how what level of income you earn and things like that. And I think those things again are some of the things that come up, but there's no way to track there's no way to kind of see the evidence of that being played out. There's no where, there's no place where, you can track and see reports and, how often these things have come up, but they do come up quite often.
Vielen Dank zum einen.
Many thanks for the comprehensive view and the intersectional approach, and to stress that those are, of course, experience and we don't have any evidence-based database. This is, of course, unfortunate. And now we continue. Just to have an idea, I can see your written questions, but are there any people wanting to speak out? I would like to ask you to raise your hand right now digitally, to use that function in Zoom in order for us to see who's interested in using his or her mic. If this is not the case, we will continue with the next written question. There's a question, rather an idea, something I have asked about, where I still have a question mark in my head. How about the inviting institutions in Germany? Can they not document those many cases and use it in order to approach a grievance mechanism? How about those actors that may be a bit more advanced when it comes to processing the history? We see the transformation taking place. Maybe those institutions are a bit more progressed as compared to a federal authority. So, open question to all the panelists. Is this something that could work when institutions obtain and gather data and will present their claims and reclamations?
Yeah, okay, that's a question to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, maybe. Mahret, would you kindly turn on your camera so we can see you and you could say something about it? I can say a little bit about that, indeed. In my initial statement, I mentioned the survey called On the Move. So there are attempts at gathering data, analyzing data. We talked about the lack of statistical data and opinion polls or surveys. And because of that lack of data, everything looks very arbitrary and transparent. And it's also true that many visa processes are carried out by external service providers, which makes it very difficult to check and verify how these processes take place. And the idea to go to the Foreign Office, that's a logical idea. But then, of course, events and projects initiated by the Foreign Office, or supported at least financially by the Foreign Office, even in that context, there are persons who don't get a visa. It looks absurd, but it has something to do with the intransparency of visa processes. And there is indeed a certain degree of arbitrariness. One must assume that there is arbitrariness. So we need to, first of all, collect data. We have to have facts, knowledge, and then we can get together to file a protest, or at least exert some pressure. Thank you. Thank you for that. Wale also wanted to take the floor. And here you have the floor.
All right, yeah, sure. I mean, absolutely. I was just
Ja,
ganz
say that, klar, das wollte ich nämlich auch noch mal sagen.
This is an area where,
Das ist natürlich ein Bereich,
it needs a lot of, or it can benefit from a lot of collaboration, of course.
Wo
so that,
Zusammenarbeit
I
richtig
mentioned
Früchte
that
tragen kann.
one of the things that
Ich
we're
habe ja schon
missing
gesagt, dass uns
is
eines fehlt, nämlich
I guess regularization of reporting
eine
and regularization of
Regularisierung der
audits.
Berichterstattung, eine
But I think
Durchführung
this is an
von
area where
Audits, von Prüfungen.
in
Und das ist
connection
ein
to,
Bereich,
whether it's research think tanks, and of course research think tanks also based on the continent, as well as universities also based on the continent, can actually provide that useful intervention that can at least start it off. Right. I think similar projects, these are areas in which we've seen, I guess, similar projects being undertaken that have really had some transformative, impacts on, I guess, relations. If I use, for example, the recent one on the restitution reports, reports like that really give a basis for making those arguments. They really give a basis for organizing around real change. And I think in this type of situation, just because of how widespread and the complexity behind that kind, I guess, and the complexity behind the entire visa system, you're looking at a lot of stakeholder engagement, being a useful force for really unpacking some of that data and some of those reports. And I think to the level of the kinds of data that we're looking at and the kinds of data that we need, I don't think it's something that any one particular visa organization or embassy can handle on their own. I think it's definitely something that needs the cooperation of multiple organizations, and that obviously will need a lot of resources drawn from local and international universities as well as think tanks as well. But I do think it's something that is necessary, and it's something that will really help to shape exactly what it is that we're looking to change.
Vielen Dank. Möchte jemand noch was dazu?
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to take the floor?
Ansonsten würde ich auf die
If not, I'm going to look at the next question.
Moi, je pense que
I think
il a été établi que le passé colonial a créé dans
and it was said already that the colonial past
une histoire entrelacée qui jusqu'à présent avait complètement été oubliée par rapport à l'Afrique.
has created repercussions, reverberations, and that is carried on until the present day. We tend to forget that European modernity would never have been the same hadn't Europe been in contact with the African continent. Contact with Africa triggered many events on many different levels, in many different ways. And here we must recognize that in Europe there is a legacy. A legacy that is being discussed. And it would be possible now to look at the relations between Europe and Africa and to rethink those relations, redesign those relations when it comes to justice and the law. Currently, we notice that there are ethnological museums, zoos, companies and raw materials and all kind of genetic heritage that is in Europe. But for historical reasons, those things could not be used. And that could be a foundation to rethink the relations between Europe and Africa. There was time that Europe and Africa spent together, and today we could have some kind of a renaissance of our relations. That would not only be focused on decolonialization, we could rethink our relations as if colonialism hadn't happened. So this is, I think, what we should focus on, relations without colonialism. When it comes to the museums, how could we imagine a museum of a new kind if only the people of one single continent have access to this world heritage? Well, of course, there might be one solution saying that these historical objects or artifacts will be sent back to their place of origin. Maybe that wouldn't be such a good solution. So we have to overcome the monologue that is being conducted. We have to embark on a true and genuine dialogue. We need to ensure transparency and equality. And we also have to have in mind that there is human rights that are applicable for all. This is also very interesting, the question of colonialization. We think what we are doing now is really done on a cosmetic level only. We are not digging deep enough, so to say. And so maybe also we need new initiatives. And my question goes to the diplomats of color. Do you sometimes have a feeling that you are used as a kind of fig leaf while we are already doing enough instead of people really listening to you? That's an interesting question. Ever since 2019, our organization has been up and running, and within the Foreign Office of Germany, we have achieved many changes. When we compare the present situation to 2019, I can see changes. In 2019, many colleagues said, why do we need such an initiative? We have 227 embassies. We are international anyway. We are all very intercultural. We don't need an organization. And our network, in spite of that original comment, has grown, and we have triggered changes also within the Foreign Office. Meanwhile, we have developed a diversity strategy. We have our own desk for diversity and equal opportunities. And Annalena Baerbock has now published also a strategy on feminist foreign policy. And that strategy explicitly uses the dimension of intersectionalities and the integration of marginalized perspectives into conflict resolution. These are new things. In 2019, we didn't have any of that. So we see a large degree of open-mindedness. And I think the Foreign Office is a good example to many other German ministries. Of course, we are still a public authority. We are a ministry, and changes happen very slowly, incrementally. And the perspectives that we're talking about today are the perspectives that will be here to stay for a long time to come. But we are here, we are visible. We have already shaped processes of change together with the individual departments and desks and our leadership. And it shows there is a potential that we could use to arrive at a decolonial future. Thank you very much. We have another question here. It's a historical question, a specific question. It's about a question about the descendants of German settlers in Namibia. They don't need a visa to come to Germany or the Schengen area. They live in Namibia. They're descendants of German colonial settlers or rulers. They can get a Schengen visa, and other citizens of Namibia don't get a visa. Well, I'm not sure, can we really answer that question? If we have expertise in such issues amongst our listeners, raise your hand and join in the discussion. If we don't have an answer, at least it's an example of the double standards that are persisting until the present day. Anyone who has expertise regarding the relationship between Germany and Namibia and visa issues? Yes, there is a participant in the discussion who wants to take the floor, and Mahret also wants to join in. I don't have an answer to the question, but let me add and even extend that question, and maybe the expert who wants to answer can respond to my question as well. Well, what I was wondering about is how about the descendants of German settlers in Namibia? Do they have Namibian passports or do they hold German passports? And the next question concerns another situation. In Kenya at the moment, there is a discussion about lifting the visa obligation if you want to travel to Kenya. Maybe you have some more knowledge about that, because I was wondering, how about the standards? Who is a member of the African diaspora, and how will the African diaspora be defined? Great. So I will hand over to our expert who raised the hand. I'm not sure, is that person still with us, or is that person already on stage, so to say, on our panel? If that person is still with us, raise your hand again. Or yeah, it's Lisanna Kelt. Maybe our technicians could give her the floor. The person needs to be put as a panelist, needs to be defined in Zoom as a panelist so that we can hear her. So you have the floor, Lisanna.
Hört man mich jetzt?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, also ich war nicht die Person, die sich eigentlich gemeldet
hat. I wasn't the person that who originally raised the hand, but since there's seems to be nobody here, let me take the floor. I do not have a direct answer, and I don't think there is a logical answer that can be given, because it's an extremely racist policy. I think the person that asked the question had in mind that the descendants of German settlers and German colonializers are being given a German passport. Because there is a colonial and racist passport logic. Germany is an extreme case. And that goes back to the colonial times and National Socialism. So everybody who has a German descent will be given a German passport. So it's the ius sanguinis, the blood law, that gives German descendants the right to be given a German passport. And probably this is what was meant in that question. So descendants of German settlers can get a German passport easily and profit a lot from this historical descent.
Ja, vielen Dank für den Kommentar.
Thank you for this comment.
Kein Problem, gerne, dass Sie hier trotzdem gesprochen haben.
Thanks for taking the floor, by the way.
Hätte ich noch eine weitere Person, die auf die
But there is another person that might take the floor. And here we have a question regarding Namibia again and an experience. I'd like to call Namupa. She asked a question in the Q&A tool. Could you raise your hand so we know who you are, so we can give you the floor?
Sie dann auf die Bühne holen kann. Wunderbar.
Great.
Wir freuen uns auf.
We are happy to have you, and we are keen on listening to your experience.
Hallo.
Hello.
Also mein Name ist Nampa.
I am Nampa.
Bin aus Namibia.
I am from Namibia, and I'm currently in Namibia until tomorrow night, and then I fly back to Germany with my child.
I would like to speak in English. I think it's and I want to share my experience. My experiences was for my last visa application, which was just a nightmare. And Katharina Hoffmann, who's also in here, can actually also share from her perspective, if she wants, what was happening on the German side, because the invitation came from the University in Oldenburg. I'm a journalist and researcher, and I was invited by the by Karl Ossietzky University in Oldenburg for workshops based on German colonialism and African LGBTQI rights and related topics. So I was in December. I was in Berlin for a similar event, kind of, and I had applied on the. So firstly, the process is you apply online, which means you first have to book an appointment. This appointment will depend on what days are available, and depending on how busy they are, it could be months ahead, booked out or not. So in December, it was still okay. My booking, I got a booking fairly easy, but for instance, one of the things in December that really bugged me out is on the application form, which you also fill out online, but then you take the application form. Firstly, I don't stay. Somebody, Tiaji, you mentioned about, or somebody mentioned about traveling within, we don't have a visa or an embassy in the town where I'm staying. So I had to travel to go to the capital where I could go to the German embassy and apply. So the application, for instance, a nice, it looked, and we're talking about decolonial, and these are also some of these things where you can see it just remains a conversation and nothing tangible, because we had on the application, there's, for instance, on your gender, you can specify what gender, or you can specify unspecified. So as a non-binary, I put on unspecified because there was no non-binary whatever. I get to the counter at the embassy, and that's the first question I'm asked. Why did I put on unspecified? I'm like, because you had the option. And I felt the option was more fitting than anything else. So that was an issue, but it was an issue that barred me from getting the thingy. But why I'm bringing up the Berlin application in December is because it was for a similar well, basically for the same type of event like I'm doing now. And there, for instance, I had to pay a visa Gebühren. On the application that I'm going on now, I didn't have to pay visa Gebühren. So you also never really know what you have to pay, what you don't have to pay, even if you go for the same thing over and over again. So that is also an issue. Then I'll be gone for a month. So I have a 6-year-old child who is traveling with me, also by invitation of the university, who's also taking care of all the financial needs. We've also got an invitation letter and everything. On the application or somewhere in the thing, it says, it doesn't exactly say both parents have to be there. It said it might be needed, but I also have an older daughter who had also traveled to Germany before, for instance. And in her case, I just needed a letter from the father who gave travel permission, certified by the police, and that was okay. In this instance, that is what the same thing that I was going to do with the little one. That was not enough for the German embassy. The father had to be there in person. The father does not live with us. We are not together. He lives 700 kilometers away. He had to come. He had to be there in physically to sign that. So he wasn't able to travel, of course, at the time, which we didn't know until we arrived to our appointment, that we traveled from almost 400 kilometers away. So as we arrived, they couldn't process. They accepted my application, but not the child's application because the father wasn't there. And then they told us we should just go back and keep checking online to see if we would get another opening to travel back to Windhoek and apply for this process again for the child's travel. And this was after explaining that we don't live in Windhoek, that we just traveled all the way for this, that it was not a thing that had ever been a requirement that I remember from my daughter, or that is anywhere really specified as it's a must that both parents are there. But they wouldn't hear us on that, and then they just said we had to go back and make another, and see when we get another opening for a visa application, for a visa appointment for the child. So that same day, I went home and checked on the application, on the visa, where you book your appointments. All the appointments were already past the date that we were supposed to fly, which I also informed them about. They said there's nothing they can do. I must just see if somebody cancels, maybe somebody might cancel, and then I must quickly grab that appointment. So basically just sit around the computer the whole time and wait, check that appointment book the whole time and see if something opens. Eventually, through Katharina then also wrote from Germany, and the university was willing, and this is where Katharina can maybe speak a little bit more on. The university was willing to approach the embassy, and Katharina also managed to get other people, organizations that were willing to help with the situation. But basically, we had to, later, eventually, they contacted us after we all wrote to them again. They contacted us and told us, okay, they finally have an appointment open if we would take this. But this also came only after Katharina wrote to them from Germany and everything else. So but then they gave us the appointment in the afternoon via email. And we had to be in Windhoek the next morning. So me and the child, and now the father must be there. We had to be in Windhoek the next morning. The father still lived 700 kilometers away, so it was still an impossible journey for him to make it on the spur of the moment like that. So we ended up in Windhoek and just kind of, begged them to take the application basically, or just take it. And then they gave the father until the 29th of May, I think it was, to then come in and sign the application, or sign that the child may travel. And somebody also mentioned about, you know, how there's no trust, for instance, in our, you know, like in the African state or whatever bureaucracies, because, for instance, even with the letter, they wouldn't accept a certified letter from the police because they said it could be faked. So they can't take that. So that is why the father had to be there in person. So then they said here time until the 29th of May, I think it was, to be there. And he then managed to get there for the 29th, which was the last day, and he was on time, basically. It's still the last day, but he was on time. But then the embassy follows public holidays in Germany. So he arrived on the day when it was Pfingstmontag in Germany, and the embassy was closed. So it was just a nightmare. Eventually, yes, I'm almost at the end of all this, but it was really...
Thank you.
Yeah, at the end of the day, what ended up happening is that the father had to travel back. He couldn't stay another day to stay and sign then the next day when it's not public holiday. So what happened is I had to go to the children's court here in Swakop and apply for my child to travel with state permission that basically takes the Vollmacht of the father. And that was also almost an issue, because at first didn't want that because I don't have sole custody. And then I told them, hello, this is a letter from the court. And if this is not going to work, then really, yeah. And that is then how we finally are able to travel tomorrow. But if Katharina wants to add something from the German side, if there is time, or what the university also, you know, yeah.
Dankeschön. Vielen, vielen Dank erstmal für das Schildern dieser...
Many thanks for your visualization of the process. This is something that really influences your quality of life. I mean, it is highly emotional. It's fully stressful if you want to travel with your child, which is already quite stressful, and they impose all those different conditions on you. And this is just one of many cases and incidents. And unfortunately, we may not delve deeper into this case from the German side because of time constraints, but we do have some margin. There is sometimes a leverage when we have individual people that are able to move things forward to finally have an happy outcome. So many thanks for these impressions. And with that, we have come to the end of our session. I think we have covered many different questions. Thank you so much to our audience to be on board, to be concentrated, and I hope that everything worked out fine on the YouTube stream. And with that, I would like to ask you last question to Mahret Kupka, who gave us the introduction and had the very interesting idea to tell us what her take-home messages are from today. Mahret, over to you. Thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you to all of those involved in the discussion, asking their questions. And I have put down a few notes in parallel that I would like to briefly sum up. I cannot read it all out because of time constraints, but a big issue is that the practices that we see in reality is not really reflecting the reality in our globalized world, and we necessarily need a revisiting of the procedures. What is important to notice as well is money, that it's about a lot of money. Those application fees are not to be neglected, and independently of if this is going to be approved or not approved, the fee is going to be paid. When we talk about visas from students, so a lot of business money pours into Europe, and the question is what the whereabouts of the money is. And Gouaffo gave us an example talking about language courses and that a lot of money is made by those language courses and that the Goethe institutes are financing their projects via those language courses, and they're not, so students are not taking the courses out of pleasure, but because they want to study or they need the necessary language proficiency tests in order to be able to work. And this does not necessarily mean that you will be granted a visa. And a question that I keep on asking myself is what the decision makers in the African countries are doing, what interests do they represent, what their responsibilities are. Maybe we can include them more in those transformation processes and to think about further possibilities. It is still unclear of how those approval processes really work. We need a lot more transparency in order to avoid arbitrariness. It has to become clearer why visas are rejected. And I think it was quite nice to talk about the possibility of receiving a refund when or compensation when the visa is not granted. And then when we outsource the processes to a third party to talk about benefits and disadvantages. And what I have talked, we need a homologization, a simplification and digitalization of visa processes, and last but not least, in terms of what we've just heard, there are numerous cases that are quite similar, and would like to underline that this dehumanizing aspect of the process is of course something that does not end with the visa process, that it continues once entering Europe with absurd questions you have to face and power plays on the ground, and that the granting processes do have to do or differentiate between class and gender. I do take home that we need more statistics, more data to work on, and more transparency. So I think this is mainly what I have drawn up as a conclusion, and I would claim for having a continued process. So maybe this is important to mention for the decolonial dialogues. It's important to talk about these issues, politics and mobility. This is something that we have to take up in our serious, because it is essential, it is very important, and this is an issue where we have to keep on exchanging ideas and hope that this maybe at least step by step will change. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you so much to you, Mahret. Thanks to all the other panelists. Came to an end quite quickly, so we have to wrap up quickly. If you have put in some very important ideas that might make room for a separate debate, and I would really welcome if the Heinrich-Böll Foundation could continue this dialogue and create space or spaces for those different perspectives to attract attention to the topic. And I think there's more need indeed to delve a bit deeper into the issue. But right now, I would like to come to an end. Fare you well. See you next time. Thank you so much for being with us. And then, of course, I would like to invite you for our next session. We have an upcoming summer break, and then we will be back here again September 21st, where we'll talk about the relationship between human and nature and how we can protect biodiversity in Europe and in Africa. This is something we want to talk about, and we will touch upon questions of asymmetry. But right now, I would like to bid you farewell and hope you have a nice evening on the African continent. It's rainy season, so I hope you enjoy your evening. Hope to see you soon back here. Bye-bye.